So I thought I'd have a go at cracking the definition of esports, which is a question I faced numerous times over the last few years. And it's really been very interesting to see how the definition's evolved. And I think for me that's the crucial point, is that we often as philosophers spend time trying to define concepts as if they're fixed in time. But we know that they're not. We know that sports, esports, music, all these concepts are porous, they're fluid, their boundaries between them vary considerably depending on the context, depending on the time period, and things that we typically today might call a sport may at some point become culture. I think of mob football is a great example. Mob football back in 19th century England involved towns playing a mob game of football where one town would compete against another town and get the ball from one end to the other. We don't talk about that as sport anymore. It's simply a cultural kind of ritual. And I think that's also a complicating factor in how we define anything, is that it's so embedded within the social and cultural context that the definition of it as one thing or another sort of betrays logic because of those conditions. So whilst esports and the industry of esports certainly have a sense of what fits within it at the moment, there are other things being brought into that territory that make it complicated and difficult to say that one thing is or isn't esports. I know that the Poker Federation wants to call itself an esport. I know that virtual reality activities that involve computer-generated imagery like Zwift want to be called esports, and yet the people that work in the industry typically see the traditional esports as those that are essentially console or PC-based gaming, using keyboards or using game controllers and operating within a computer game. So the simple definition that I think people are quite happy to accept is that it's organised forms of competition within video games. But the problem occurs that, let's imagine you just go and play Rocket League with a friend in a competition that's a local event, that's not organised, that there's no kind of structure around. You could still quite comfortably say that's a esport, in the same way that if you went for a kickabout on a playing field with some friends, you're playing sport. So the problem then becomes not so much a matter of defining the conceptual elements of the activity, it's more about defining the sort of locus of interests that operate around it. Where does the money come from? Who's able to work within the structures that limit what sorts of things we can say esports is? And that's where it becomes complicated, that there is no sort of boundary. This is the myth of the whole definition. There is no boundary around esports. Many of these things that currently aren't considered to be an esport could quite comfortably be so if we permitted them to. And the same with sports. We've seen this actually in the last few years with the Olympic Games. The fact that now skateboarding is considered to be an Olympic sport has brought about a transition in how we define it. So all of these elements are essentially creating boundaries that are temporal, which is why we shouldn't get too stuck on defining one thing as an esport or not. We also should be mindful of the fact that the interface by which esports takes place, the gaming interface that we use, is inevitably going to be transformed by technology. So whilst we still more or less play esports using game controllers and keyboards, those interfaces are not going to be here for very much longer. We are going to transform the way we interface with digital from simply voice gestures or indeed movement gestures to telepathic thought processes that allow us then to exert impact on the physical or digital world. We can see these impacts coming down the line, and as a result we'll have completely different definitions of esports. So rather than get locked into one single definition because it's convenient, because it allows us to say, well, poker isn't an esport, but Rocket League is, we need to remain open. We need to remember that we're still quite an embryonic industry, an embryonic community of practitioners that are trying to create alternative forms of competition within digital space. And yet remember that despite we've had gaming for 40, 50 years now, it's still the early days. If you compare it to the film industry, we're still sort of just getting out of the silent film era. And I think what we'll see in the future is esports that are dramatically different from what we see today. And I want to be part of that change. I want to see that through and embrace a world where we have these multifaceted and diverse communities of esport players. Because that's the final point I want to make, is that currently esports works for some people, but not for others. And if we really want to be inclusive, we have to keep expanding the boundaries.